Hello and welcome to another edition of GCSE History Revision with me, Mr. C. Today we're going to be focusing in on the Russian Revolution, or as the part of the course we've got. Remember, it's not a bit like the Cold War. The name of the course isn't actually a bit what you might think it is. The official name of the course, the bit we're studying, is Russia and the Soviet Union 1905 to 1924. Some GCSEs have other titles. Make sure, as I said before, you check what the title of your exam is, but the dates that we're focusing on are 1905 to 1924. Right, now the first image there had Lenin, which we're going to get into, but actually we should start with the individual at the beginning is, of course, this man, Tsar Nicholas II, the leader of Russia, the Tsar, their version of a king. It's a bit like Kaiser in Germany, etc., etc. And we should have to set the scene what Russia was like in 1905. So it was ruled totally, absolutely by one man, by the monarch, the Tsar Nicholas II. And he was known as the Little Father by the people. So there's this religious connotation, divine rule of kings. He was in totally control, all power consolidated in him. Now, we're going to focus on more. There's going to be another revolution in 1905. We have to explain some of the reasons for that. But he himself is one of the reasons why there's going to be a revolution. Why? Well, he was apparently a very nice man, wasn't he? He loved his family, very uxorious, always keen to just be a nice bloke. But he was a bit ineffectual and not very popular. In fact, one of his cabinet ministers said that the Tsar Nicholas was not fit to run a village post office, which is a bit mean when you're considering you're governing the biggest country in the world. And that's the problem. Russia was the biggest country in the world. It was extremely diverse, lots of different languages, different religions, way up to the Pacific, into the Atlantic, etc. Hard to manage, and he perhaps was ineffectual of it. It's a very militaristic society, and again, he was seen as not terribly this great leader of the military, and indeed, the Russian military had faced a horrendous loss against the tiny minnows, the Japanese. The Battle of Tsushima in the Russo-Japanese War, which we don't need to really get into, but Russia had lost. So it looks embarrassing. And a bit of the blame is put on him because he's the leader of the armed forces. Other issues with Russia, well, economic problems, very backward economy, agricultural, horse and cart. But now at the beginning of the 20th century, countries like Britain, of which his cousin, of course, George, was a leader of. No, it was it was George, wasn't it? Was the king of. Britain was expanding, industrializing, even democratizing, all that stuff. Russia is still stuck in the quagmire of feudalism. Speaking of which, the condition of peasants, the idea of serfdom, sort of a kind of form of slavery, had only just been abolished in Russia. The conditions of the peasants in the countryside was awful. Again, putting a bit of blame on the Tsar. So no industrialization, poor conditions in the countrysides, bad living conditions, military losses, an ineffectual leader. Things are not looking very good. And it leads on to a revolution in 1905. Right, so as I said, this leads on to the 1905 revolution. This is a good caveat because our studies, there are actually 3 Russian revolutions that we need to study. One is the 1905 revolution, which actually isn't really a revolution because it fails. The Tsar does not lose his role. Then there's the February Revolution of 1917, where the Tsar does abdicate. But then there's another revolution in October of 1917. It is vitally important that you remember the differences in these revolutions. Let's start though with the 1905 revolutions. Now I've gone over many of the long-term causes. The 2 short-term causes, well, I've already mentioned it, the Battle of Tsushima and the Russia-Japanese War. The other short-term reason is this event here known as Bloody Sunday. And this all stemmed from some workers who were sacked in the Putilov factory, armaments factory. They were sacked and a huge protest came about, and it was led by this man called Father Gapon, who was a trade union leader, definitely. Was he a priest? Yeah, I think there's sort of elements of that. It's difficult to know. Anyway, he had led a protest from workers from that. This is extraordinary in Tsarist Russia. Not type of this thing didn't happen. You adhered to the Tsar no matter what, whatever they did. There wasn't much space because it was quite an oppressive autocracy to protest. Anyway, they do. They get brutally crushed, of course, but it sparked something. This happened in January 1905. It sparked things. More and more things came about. And one big thing that came about was the Potemkin Mutiny If you've ever watched Sergei Eisenstein's excellent film of the pram going down the steps of Odessa, that's all about the Potemkin Mutiny. This is a good time. That was made by Stalinist Soviet propagandists. But it's this idea. The Potemkin Mutiny was some sailors on the battleship Potemkin in the Black Sea, the port of Odessa. They mutinied against their leaders and went off, and they sort of sailed around the Black Sea a bit, fighting off, hating the idea of Tsarist Russia. Eventually they were captured, of course. I think they were captured in Bulgaria or Romania or something, weren't they? And then pushed off, punished and executed, whatever. But it was an example where the soldiers, in this case actually the sailors, who were meant to be fighting for Tsarist Russia, had mutinied. The other thing to remember at this point is the October Manifesto. So in October of 1905, the Tsar's chief minister, a man called Witte, he's basically convinced the Tsar, saying, you need to sign a document promising various different freedoms to stop the protesters. And he promised freedom of expression. He promised a parliament known as Duma, that they would be created, have more representation, etc. This seemed to work and people seemed happy, and that ultimately answers this question, which is important. It's a failed revolution. The Tsar survives. What are the reasons why the Tsar resigns? Well, one is he passes this October Manifesto promising things. Fine. The second one thing, despite the potential Potemkin mutiny, actually the military stayed loyal to the Tsar. He didn't lose total control of his army. That's very, very important. The third reason is that the opposition was disorganized. You had Marxists, you had constitutional monarchists, you had the right-wingers as well. There was no united front. So Witte and the Tsar could actually blame other people, and they did. They blamed the Black Hundreds, wasn't it? The opposition groups. They could just make a scapegoat quite easily. Division was a part of it. Okay, so the October Manifesto promised this idea of Dumas, and they were created. But before we do that, there was something else that came out after the 1905 revolution, and this was the creation of things called Soviets. Soviet is the Russian word for union, and it was a collection of workers, collection of individuals. The St. Petersburg Soviet was the sort of key Soviets, the key workers within the Soviet, within St. Petersburg. They united, and actually, my previous point was that during the 1905 revolution, they were quite disorganized, the opposition groups. So what they needed to do was organize themselves, and they did. They organized themselves into Soviet. We'll park that for the moment, because the idea of Soviets become very important later on. But what I want to focus in on now is the creation of these things called Dumas. Tsar Nicholas II said, I will carry out my promises I made in October Manifesto, and I will create a parliament. I will create what I know as a Duma. And so he does. There's elections, and shock, horror, the political parties that don't support the Tsar get elected in a majority. My goodness me, the Tsar's thinking, we cannot have this. By this time as well, the Tsar has a new chief minister by the name of Stolypin, which we'll look at him more in a minute. They say, this is outrageous. We cannot have a situation whereby the Tsar is not the most popular person. And indeed, this Duma, the first Duma, put all sorts of promises, outlandish things like freedom of speech, freedom of press, freedom of assembly, outrageous. No, it gets disbanded. No, thank you very much. Similarly, the second Duma tried to push a little bit more. No. So then the third and the fourth Duma come in, and the third and the fourth Duma, known as the Duma of lackeys and yes men, essentially just do what the Tsar wants. They are only people who really get involved are people who support the Tsar. It becomes a talking shop. It becomes a pointless thing. So the Tsar has promised these Dumas. Wonderful, thank you very much, Mr. Tsar. But actually, there's no substance in them whatsoever. There's no democracy. Their election results are that if the election creates parties that are opposed to the Tsar, he doesn't like that, so he just dismisses them. They are useless. Despite the failures of the Duma, one thing that does come out of the Duma is this creation of other political parties, or as they became known, opposition groups. Yes, they don't have much power, but they exist, and they will grow in significance. Now, there are three I want to focus in on, and the first two kind of go on our broad left and right spectrum, sort of. On the right-ish, they're more sort of centrist and right. You had, they were kind of known as the centrists, but there were people like cadets or constitutional Democrats, or even they're sometimes known as Octoberists. What Octoberists, they believed in the October Manifesto, the bit that the Tsar mentioned, and they were saying, yeah, let's work with the Tsar. and again, this goes with this constitutional Democrats. They thought, we're happy to keep the Tsar as long as it's a constitutional monarch. We have the power in Duma, but we have a monarch to do things. It's a bit like Britain would have been. And they would have been pushed on through these more sort of to the right. To the left of them were known as the SRs, the Social Revolutionaries. Now, they were a ragtag bunch, never quite united. Trudevites, the odd anarchist in there, some others who might like the idea of the Tsar, but mostly they would be saying, no, we need a democracy, we need to sort ourselves out, and they represented the left. They would have been the most anti-Tsar. So that's why the Octoberists and others were eventually controlling the third and fourth Dumas. These first one or two Dumas, indeed the Trudevites win the first Duma, don't they? So there we go. There is a third group which is tiny at this stage, but grows into significant. And they, the reason why is because they split. They were initially known as the Social Democrats, but in 1903 they split, and indeed they split whilst being in a pub in London. And if you go and watch my Lenin in London video, you will see the location where they split. They split off to form the Bolshevik Party and the Menshevik Party. These are formed on Marxist principles, what will be known as communism, but in 1903 when they split, and by the time of the Dumas, it wasn't really known as communism, it would be more of the Bolshevik, more of the known as Marxism, and indeed Bolshevism and Mensheviks. The Bolshevists, of course, Bolsheviks means a majority, doesn't it? And I've told the story in my Lenin video. They were tiny and they were not ready for the 1905 revolution, and a bit chaotic. All our cast of sun, the Lenin was in probably London at that point, indeed, at the split of things in that pub up in the Holborn area. But so they will be starting there in the Dumas, but actually the Dumas were dominated by our first two groups. Now, I mentioned that the Tsar had a new prime minister, effectively, and indeed he does. It's by the name of a man called Peter Stolypin. He dominates the Dumas and he pushes forward many various things. He has a carrot and a stick approach. Let's focus on the carrot, the reforms he gives to the peasant. He gives them land, he sets up a peasant's bank for them to learn various things, and he released them from the idea of having to work on a commune, a mere. Before, many peasants have felt they were tied to working on a specific farm. Stolypin said, no, you can go off and we'll even give you money to do it. So he's getting a bit of the peasants on his side. This, though, goes with brutal repression, especially anybody who goes against the Tsar in those Dumas. He executes them, he persecutes them, he puts them in jail. Indeed, the hangman's noose became known as Stolypin's necktie, the idea of anybody going against the Tsar gets the chop. He is eventually assassinated in the theatre whilst the Tsar is there in 1911. So he was a completely disliked person across Russia. Interestingly, he's Vladimir Putin's favourite politician from history, but there we go. That also corresponds. Another final thing just to quickly talk about before we move on to the First World War, which is an integral bit. There was another protest in 1912 in the Lena goldfields. This is interesting and it's very different. Now, the 1905 revolution just took place in St. Petersburg, and then, of course, the battleship Potemkin down in Odessa. But by 1912, there's discontent stretches a bit to the countryside, and indeed the Lena goldfield, which is this huge area of land along the river Lena into Siberia, digging gold. The people in there had to work in horrendous conditions, terrible Russian weather, and the worst of all, they had to eat rotting horse meat. Oh, everyone hates that. Anyway, they protest, and it is brutally repressed. 500 people, 500 of the workers are executed, shot because they protested against it. Now, news spreads like wildfire. We're getting to 1912 now, where maybe there's a bit more of a technology, newspapers, telegram, etc. The news can get out, and it reaches to St. Petersburg, and indeed it reaches out to Europe, where everybody says, now, I'm not sure about this. This is not a jolly good show. This is all happening on the eve of the First World War, which is our next topic. So the Tsar is slightly losing control. He's having to oppress, rather than, and his promises of giving land reform and his promises of giving a Duma have not worked out. We get to a key event, the First World War. So the First World War, and this really is the nail in the coffin for the Tsar. Why? Because it has such profound effects, and those effects can be put into the categories of economic, social, political. We can also put in military, which often kind of gets put in with the political. Let's start with some of the more smaller ones. Economic then. It cost 17 billion rubles, this war, in a country that doesn't have much money, as it were, in the centralized state. Why? Because they don't have the industrial might that Germany had, indeed of Britain. So Germany could make all these machines. Russia simply couldn't compete. They were losing lots and lots and lots of money. Bad news. Social, well, it causes huge loss of life. That's no two ways about that. Lots of young men dying. This is going to have a huge social impact. People at home, the Russian mothers, the great, powerful Russian mother, never mess with the Russian mother, gets very, very annoyed with this. Why? Well, militarily, it was a disaster. The Battle of the Masurian Lakes in modern-day Poland was brutal losses for the Russians, bogged down in the mud, the Germans fighting them, killing and maiming, all horrendous stuff. Really bad for the Russians. Why? Well, as I said, they're not very militaristic in terms of the machinery. They're still fighting on horseback. That is not a great attack against German machine guns going on horseback. It was a disaster. To that end, the Tsar makes a rather strange decision. He's technically head of the armed forces. The war's not going very well. So what does he do? He decides to go to the front line himself. I'll fight them. What a terrible idea, because this now means he gets more of the blame. All the problems, he might be able to distance himself, blame the generals if it was before. But now, because he's there, he gets a lot of the blame. And so this is why it has a strong political effect. The position of the Tsar is weakened by him taking the blame of the First World War. So things are going very, very badly for Russia in World War I. Whilst the Tsar is over on the front line, the Tsarina, his wife, Alexandra, is having a lot of influence put upon her by this man, Grigory Rasputin. Who was he? Well, this is obviously the part of the course that's so famous. Why is this important for our GCSE? He was a monk, a mystic, as he's often known, and he had told the Tsarina that he was able to heal her son, Alexei, who suffered from haemophilia. And there was some suggestion that Alexei got better. It's not to do with Rasputin's magic might, of course it's not, but it happened to be there at the same time. He became rather iconic in the Russian court, and how do I put this nicely? Many of the women in the Russian royal family and in the court surrounding the Tsarina were quite enraptured by him, and it meant some of the men were quite envious of him, of course, but he had this huge power and this mysticism over everybody. This is at a difficult time because, as I say, the Tsar was off fighting the Germans over in the Eastern Front, and actually the person who was running Russia was meant to be his wife, the Tsarina. She's being influenced by this mad monk. Things don't go very, very well. So that's why this is another example of the discontent, the political effect. Russia is being led by who knows. Now, I've mentioned as well there was an element of jealousy, but also this idea, maybe quite rightly, some of the other people in the court did not like the influence of Rasputin, and so they decided to kill him. And it's worth talking about his death now because everybody loves it and nobody quite knows what to do. But essentially he was poisoned. He was having a big drinking session with various different members of the government. He was poisoned. He goes into a coma, they chuck him into the river, whatever the case. There was a gunshot as well. I think he was shot at some point, as well as he was thrown into the river having been poisoned and being shot. But apparently they found scrape marks under the ice and ice in his fingernails or something. I don't know if that's apocryphal, but the point was everyone's trying to say he was such a mystic, he took so long to die. He would not die. They could not get rid of him, but he did ultimately, and the influence of Rasputin goes. Okay, so by the time we get to February of 1917, Russia is at boiling point. Terrible economic conditions, terrible social conditions. Rasputin and that debacle, total under no respect anymore for the royal family. And crucially, the Russian military has lost morale. Why? Because of the failures of the First World War. Something is going to go horribly wrong, and indeed it does. And March, February, the Russian calendar is slightly different from us, but let's go stick with the Russian calendar. February of 1917, what's amazingly, it starts with women. It was into the International Women's Protest March. Women were marching through the streets of Petrograd, as it was known then, the capital of Russia, marching for, better rights. Again, never mess with a Russian mother. And then they protest. This obviously then escalates. It snowballs. Workers come out. The Petrograd Soviet comes out with anger and mistrust. Crucially, the Pavlovsky Regiment, the regiment of soldiers in St. Petersburg, or Petrograd as known, unlike in 1905, they don't remain loyal to the Tsar. They break that and they go and turn their guns, give guns to workers, etc. That's where things start to lose control. Crucially then, the difference between the February of 1917 revolution and the 1905 revolution is that the military mutinies. He loses control of the army. So what happens? A message gets sent to the Tsar, who has to race back from the front line. He's been fighting World War I, of course, in Poland. He races back, but by then it's too late. He's lost control. And the government has to topple on the 1st of March 1917. He abdicates on a railway platform, Duma railway station. His brother formally kind of takes over, but it's a disaster. Eventually, the Romanovs end. That's the end of centuries of Russian royal family just ends. Where does Russia go now? Who rules Russia? That is a very good question, and the answer is two. Two groups of people are controlling Russia post the abdication of the Tsar. One is the Petrograd Soviet, which we'll talk about in a bit. The other is the Provisional Government, for a time led by this man, Alexander Kerensky. He doesn't immediately take power in the Provisional Government. He doesn't do it until a bit in the summer, but he really is the sort of person we associate with the Provisional Government. Who are the Provgov and what do? Well, they are just that. They are the government. They are to rule Russia until they can sort out all the problems, until they can run an election, etc., etc. They make several mistakes, and one thing we're going to really talk about is the weaknesses of the Provisional Government. But one of the big mistakes they do is to carry on with the war. We'll discuss that more in a minute. Who are the Petrograd Soviet? Well, the Petrograd Soviet are the workers. We talked about the Soviets being set up after the 1905 revolution, a collection of workers in the city. And Petrograd was the capital city, the biggest city of Russia, collection of all the industrial workers. They're very powerful. Why are they so powerful? Well, they're the ones now with guns given to them from the Pavlovsky Regiment and left over from the First World War. They are a growing power. Because of the war effort, Russia is industrializing, and Petrograd is becoming an industrial power. So unions and people working in factories, etc., they're becoming more and more of a voice. Also, the Dumas are a failure, so many intellectuals and others are joining the Petrograd Soviet because they know it's going to be part of it. But crucially, the most important reason they are so powerful is order number one. What was order number one? Well, it was the rule written down that said that the military, the army, should take orders from the Petrograd Soviet, not the Provisional Government. Why would they agree to this, the Provisional Government, I don't know. But order number one meant the Petrograd Soviet controlled the army. So as long as the Provisional Government keeps the army happy, fine, okay, well, they'll be okay. But if they don't, bad news. This is coupled with the fact that the Petrograd Soviet also controlled the railways and other things, roads and all that sort of stuff. So Petrograd Soviet, extremely powerful. Kerensky, his hands are tied. Make sure, of course, you watch the Kerensky video I put on as well. With the Tsar gone, many people start to return to Russia. People have been banished before, one of whom was a man called Lenin. We've been hinting at him. He enters the scene now around April of 1917. He triumphantly returns. He gets a train across Europe, across war-torn Germany, etc., gets to Finland and enters Petrograd, or St. Petersburg as it was known then. Now, it changed, of course, St. Petersburg is no longer called St. Petersburg because it sounded too German during the First World War, so they changed it to Petrograd, slightly more Russian-sounding thing. Anyway, whatever. Lenin had arrived from Helsinki, and on his arrival, he makes a speech, and this all sort of manifests itself into eventually a document known as the April Theses, which promised all sorts of things, but crucially, it follows one thing saying the Bolsheviks are not going to work with the Petrograd Soviet or the Provisional Government. Sorry, they're not going to work with the Provisional Government. Ignore the government. That's what the idea. He wanted to end the war pretty quick, bring land back to the peasants, and there's going to be various other forms that are communist in their ideal. Communism enters onto the world, into Russia's stage with the arrival back of Lenin pushing through the April Theses. The Bolsheviks get a bit of support from this, and indeed they try their first attempt at a revolution in the July of 1917, the July days, as they're known. Lenin perhaps jumps the gun a bit too much, but can we put too much onto him? Maybe not, but it certainly was. July days was quite spontaneous. I think July days is a good example where the Bolsheviks are preparing to take power, but I think crucially the July days is more as a result of the failure of the June offensive and all sorts of things. It's an example of the weaknesses of the Provisional Government. There is discontent, there is upheaval in the streets. The Bolsheviks tried their best, but they had to recant, and indeed Lenin does go off, has to leave the country again. But it's another example of 1917 being such a tumultuous year in Russian history. By the end of August, Kerensky and the Provisional Government's control and power was very, very weak, and they face a revolt from this man, General Kornilov. So by his name, you see he's a military man. And the problem with this now is that, of course, that the military start to lose their support, their loyalty to the government. Remember, they're trying to fight a war, the First World War. Generals are trying to take over. This is a coup attempt. The reason why they're so unhappy is linked to the Bolsheviks, actually, because out in the countryside, Kornilov was down from the south, Ukraine, etc., peasants were trying to take land. Peasants taking land, outrageous. They've been emboldened by the Bolshevik and Lenin's promises that you can have your land. So they started to take them back. Kornilov did not like this, fights for the peasants, and he marches on Petrograd to take power away from the ridiculous Petrograd Soviet and Provisional government. Kornilov is going to take it back for the military. There's even hints that he might bring the Tsar back in power. Outrageous. So Kerensky has a problem. Kerensky's just fought off the July days, revolutionaries, Bolsheviks, etc. He now faces a threat from his right, from the army. He's stuck in the middle. What does he do? Well, he's weak. He can't rely on the army to support him because the army is not going to go against the general within the army. So he has to give somebody the opportunity to crush Kornilov down. Who does he do that to? He asks the Bolsheviks and their armed forces, known as the Red Guard, is going to turn into the Red Army eventually. But Kerensky says to Lenin, hey, communists, can you please quash this revolt from a general for me? And the Bolsheviks say, we are, but it's going to cost you. And we'll see how that does. So it's ironic that the Bolsheviks get their weapons, get their emboldenedness from Kerensky himself. This is the end of August 1917. It's something's going to have to happen by October. And sure enough, it does. One of the most significant events of the 20th century happens on October of 1917. What happens? Lenin and the Bolsheviks have a revolution. It's known as the October Revolution. They take and seize power away from Kerensky and the Provisional government. Why? Well, with a search now, let's see how they did it, first and foremost. Well, they have a man called Trotsky as well, key military figure. He set up something called the Military Revolutionary Committee, organizes various things. They take control of the radio station and the telegraph station so they can control communications. They surround the city. One of the first places they take as well is an armament store. So they steal all the guns and they march on the Winter Palace, the Tsarist Palace, which is so easy to climb the gates. If you ever go there, there's like a easy royal climbing frame. Get over it. And they arrest Kerensky and the Provisional government. They are in power. Why? And what we really need to know is the reasons for success. Why were the Bolsheviks able to do this? The reason why we have to ask these questions is because Bolsheviks were tiny. Barely anybody had heard of the Bolsheviks, really. Their support was not massive, and it certainly really hadn't happened outside of Petrograd, the capital city. They were a party of workers, factory workers. So the average Russian peasant out of Siberia would have no idea who these people are. Similarly with soldiers, etc. So it's amazing that this quite small ragtag group of intellectuals is able to take and seize power over the biggest country in the world. How are they able to do it? Well, good organization. Compare that to 1905. They'd organized themselves well. Trotsky managed to control it all, control the communications, etc., etc. An obviously reason for success is the failures of the Provisional government. Nobody's there to stand up for Kerensky and the Provisional government and be thinking, how about not? The third reason is the power of the Petrograd Soviet. The Petrograd Soviet weren't necessarily Bolsheviks, but they were workers and industrial workers. And they had seen the failures of the Provisional government, so they got it going. Another reason, rumours of German government paying them. The Germans, of course, are fighting World War I. One of Lenin and the Bolsheviks' promises is to end the war. So the Germans, free, yes, go pay, giving them money to do it. I'm fairly sure whether that's true. There's some suggestion maybe it's not ultimately true. And then finally, the point is maybe they did have a bit of success. Their key policies now are going to become peace-bred land. And actually, there are many, many people in Russia who definitely would have supported this idea. So, Lenin and the Bolsheviks are in power. They've taken it. Bravo! But as I said, they're so small, and there's so many other people who are thinking, what on earth has just happened here? We need to take that power back. For example, the military, those other groups I was talking about, social revolutionaries and constituent, the cadets, etc. Plus, people like the British and the French, they're going to be miffed that suddenly their key ally in the First World War has been taken over by this, I say, ragtag group. So the Bolsheviks need to act very, very quickly to get themselves consolidated in power. And they do that in various different ways. Well, they issue lots and lots of decrees. There's a decree on work, there's a decree on land, there's a decree on labor, there's a decree on peace. various different things that come on that you need to look in a bit more in depth there. But some of these decrees introduce a working day, an 8-hour working day, amazing. Some of them bring in women's rights, and eventually gets pushed to that the Soviet Union under Bolsheviks is the first country in the world to allow abortion legally. Amazing sort of stuff like that. Decree on land about ownership of the peasants is a big part of what communists is all about. Very significant. Another decree they bring in is they say they're going to have an election for constituent assemblies. Don't quite put a date on it, but it does happen. We'll see the effect of it all, but that's one thing they bring in. They also have a decree on peace. They say that they're going to make a peace deal with the Germans, and indeed they do. And that's what I really want to focus in on. It comes known as the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, and here we have a map of all the parts that they agree. Essentially, the Russians pull out of the First World War. They make a deal with the Germans, which says, we'll give you a few things as long as you say we're no longer at war. And the Germans say, all right, but it's going to cost you. And indeed, that's the case. They lose about 15% of the land, but crucially, they lose all of this land. They lose 75% of their coal fields. Unbelievable. They use about 25% of their population, the Russians, goes to Germany. Amazing stuff. What a cost. But I think this is a good example of how serious Lenin was in getting things done. He offered a promise. He promised we're going to have peace, and he delivers on it at a great cost. Well, what sort of cost? Well, enough to cause a civil war. There, as you can imagine, many people in Russia were thinking, this is ridiculous. This small group of people who've seized power, have not been democratically elected, we need to take and wrestle power back from them. And then they do, and essentially we create a civil war between the Reds, supporters of communism, and what a group known as the Whites, people who are against the idea of a Bolshevik takeover. A definite cause of this had, of course, been the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, but another one had been these elections. The Bolsheviks said, we'll have an election. They gave the election. The Bolsheviks did terribly. They got something like 10% of the seats or something like that. And Lenin thought, I'm not sure about this democracy election thing. He assumed that the Bolsheviks will win massively. They had not. So Lenin and the Bolsheviks says, we might actually ignore these results, by the way, all that stuff. Going to cause civil war. And now the way that it worked was the Reds and the Communists had controlled the central bit of Russia, because specifically Moscow and Petrograd, and actually indeed Lenin moves the capital of Russia from Petrograd, St. Petersburg, as it was known, to Moscow to centralize the control. The Whites controlled everything around this central region. And they fought a horrible, brutal war. What's amazing is they just emerged out of the First World War having to fight again. Who's doing the fighting? Well, it was the Red Guard, this army that was supporters of the Bolsheviks, and they recruit many people from that. Who fights on the other side? A real ragtag. Now, to spoiler alert, the Bolsheviks win. The communists win the Russian Civil War. And this is the real reason why the Soviet Union goes on to be for another 70 odd years, is because the counter-revolutionaries fail at this point. Why do they fail? Well, you've got a mixture of white failures and red successes. Let's start on the successes of why the communists were quite good. Well, the first one is an obvious one. They have a central command. They can fight. They consolidated it all in the middle. They have a very astute and sensible military leader in the form of Trotsky. He had run the Military Revolutionary Committee that had won the October Revolution. He did much the same with this. There was loyalty to the Bolshevik cause. Why? Well, there's a bit of mixture of, they were brutal, but at the same time they led it all. They were able to control the railways very well. They never quite lost control of various different ports, etc. They were well organized, well oiled. In contrast, the Whites on the outside were not well organized. First of all, they're spread over too far area. This is 1920s. How can somebody in the south here communicate with somebody up in the west here to communicate with someone up here? It didn't quite work. They generally spoke different languages. Part of the issue was languages. There was British support. There was a Czech legion going around. They found it very hard to communicate. They also were not united in their ideology. Some of them wanted to bring the Tsar back madly. Well, okay, the Tsar had been executed by that. I forgot to mention that. I should have done perhaps. The Tsar had been executed in the summer of 1918 along with all his family by the Bolsheviks, because it was a bad idea to have a Tsar around. But still, there were people who were going around who wanted to bring back or restore a monarchy of some sort. There were people who felt that the Bolsheviks hadn't gone far enough. There were people, the British and the French were still angry that they had left after the First World War. It was a ragtag group of all sorts of things. There were also, believe it or not, Kornilov was still there. General Kornilov was there. There was another naval guy as well, also beginning with K. Can't quite remember his name at this point. But my point is that it was leaderless, they were rudderless, they didn't know what to do. It was going to be the case that the communists were going to win. Another reason for Red success, or the Bolshevik success, was war communism, which was brutal. It abolished money in replacement for bartering, extraordinary. But the thing about communism meant that the government, the Bolshevik government, could totally control all of industry. That's one of the key things about communism, is state control of industry. And the state, therefore, were able to take over every factory. And they said every factory is making guns, making weapons, all these sort of things. So you could dedicate your entire economy to a war economy. Let the country work to winning the war. It was brutal. No scope for anything, rationing and all sorts of things. And people perished from it. And it was seen as a very aggressive approach. But it won, and it showed that Russia could be ruled with communism. Of course, there was definite opposition, and in 1921, the Bolsheviks faced a Kronstadt mutiny, yet another mutiny. These Russian military figures are not doing very well, are they, in terms of supporting the loyal leader? But the Kronstadt sailors, Kronstadt is just in St. Petersburg, by this obviously renamed Petrograd, will be soon to be renamed Leningrad. They were a naval group, and they said, well, they wanted Soviets without the Bolsheviks. So they liked the idea of communism, but they just didn't like the Bolsheviks. And they fought on the ice. The river Neva, where St. Petersburg is, they fought against them. It was brutally crushed by the Bolsheviks, of course, by the Red Army. This is a good example where the Bolsheviks were offering promises, all those decrees. They were delivering them, Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, but they were also, with a real hard-nosed brutality, crushing any opposition. Okay, nearly the end now. Lenin and the Bolsheviks win the Civil War, but the country is exhausted. Yes, they did war communism. Yes, they've shown that communism can work, but the country is ravaged by years and years of war. The First World War started in 1914. We're now early 1920s. What is left of the country is not there. It needs to industrialize quick. One of the key tenets of communism is you need industry to form you need to go away from feudalism to capitalism to industry to final communism. Russia has gone from the feudalism of the Tsar suddenly to communism. It needs a bit of capitalism. It needs a bit of industry. It needs to build up its money again. So Lenin introduces a new economic policy away from war communism to a bit of new economic policy for the reasons I've just highlighted. What did it involve? Well, it was kind of capitalism with a red communist shirt on. Yes, there's a bit of state control, but you could then also, there were small businesses. Worse yet, foreigners came in with offering advice and putting various things. There was a little bit of a capitalist market going on, and people known as NEP men became slightly richer owners, and they were going around with fur coats, etc. It was not very communist, but it got the economy moving again. So finally, in the middle of 1922, a shocking thing happens. Lenin has a stroke. He soldiers on a bit, but by 1923, he has several strokes, and he actually becomes incapacitated. He eventually dies in January 1924, only in his early 50s. Amazing. He only came into power and prominence in 1917. He's dead by 1924, yet he is seismic in his control. And he's a really interesting figure because he's an example where the individual can have such an impact on history and how it goes. And that's, I think, one of his key legacies. He has transformed Russia. It's been brutal. He's had to fight a horrible civil war. He's had to brutally oppress people. He's had to cancel elections. He's had to totally change the economy, but he's there. And Russia and the Soviet Union has been created. By 1924, it is known as the Soviet Union, capital city Moscow, ruled by the Bolsheviks, who are ruled by a communist power. He has established this new country. We'll stop that there. We are going to go on after this. Another revision session will be on Stalin, how he takes control. We've already done the Cold War. That's how the Soviet Union has progressed by the 1950s, of course. But this is where it all started. We had gone from a feudal king, Tsar Nicholas, to be replaced by another kind of dictator with a very different angle, Lenin, with several revolutions in between. I hope you enjoy that. Any questions, put them in the comments. I'll see you on the next revision session.